finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
This week is amazing. Once again, we talked to an attorney who has started a non-profit organization called the Gavel Project.
I love the name of that.
Absolutely amazing, going after all of this COVID nonsense. So we're going to go into details with him. His name is Ryan Heath. He quit his regular attorney job to start this organization. And he's going to describe what that's about and what kind of cases they're pursuing.
Especially with the changes in just recently in the news with the overturning the legal mandates
from OSHA.
So we're vaccine requirements.
Yes, we're going to get into the OSHA stuff. We're going to get into what cases he's pursuing and how he's pursuing them, which is really clever, really, really clever. So just an amazing young man. A lot of passion, and it actually makes me encouraged to know there's people like this still around.
No kidding. I love it. So before we get into our interview with him, here's a quick message from our sponsor, MR Insurance, a small business that helps physicians with their disability insurance needs. Michael L. Relvis is a CFP professional and insurance agent committed to helping physicians nationwide with their term life and disability insurance needs. He provides an objective, transparent, and education-focused process that aims to help physicians make prudent decisions and avoid overcomplicating things. He exclusively offers own occupation disability insurance policies for residents, fellows, and attending physicians. We really like Michael and know he's got your best interests at heart when it comes to disability insurance. We know he'd be happy to help you with whatever your needs are. You can find Michael at bsfreemd.com/MRinsurance or contact him at 1-800-817-4522. I will link that in the show notes for sure. He sponsored us lots last year, and we are so thankful for him again this year.
Absolutely. If I get a new disability plan and I get disabled, I'm going to identify as a neurosurgeon.
You think that'll work?
I'm a doctor, but I identify as a neurosurgeon.
I think you should. I'm going to identify as Meredith on Grey's Anatomy. That'll get paid more.
Yeah, I mean, why not, right?
There you go.
Just like I'm going to identify as I'm 70 so I can start getting maximum Social Security right now. All right, here we go with Mr. Ryan Heath. Well, we are really excited. We have Ryan Heath from the Gavel Project with us today. He is an attorney, and we are going to talk about mandates and all sorts of legal COVID stuff. So thank you so much, Ryan, for joining us, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm a lawyer from Arizona. I'm licensed here, but the majority of my work right now is actually out in California, and I do COVID-19 litigation specifically right now, focusing on children mandate issues, and we can talk more about specifically what I'm doing later. But I know that I'm excited to be here to actually provide a bit of education. I run a 501c3 nonprofit organization called the Gavel Project, and one of the primary roles of my job as the president and CEO is to come out and actually provide education to the public on what's actually happening right now in the court system relative to these COVID-19 issues.
Fantastic. So we had kind of a little bit of news, I guess good news, depending on which side you're on, last week with the Supreme Court decision, against the OSHA mandates, which I find interesting that it was an OSHA mandate. We can kind of get into why that's significant, why it wasn't just a directive, a presidential order, essentially. So tell us where we're at with this SCOTUS decision and whether or not you think it's good, bad, makes a big difference, sets up litigation, etc.
Yeah, so for the OSHA mandate, basically the court last week actually went back and reinstated the stay that was put in place by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals when it was initially filed. And that stay had been lifted by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals sometime around, I believe, mid to late November. And then all of these emergency motions were filed with the Supreme Court. And now we are here today because where we're at today is that the OSHA mandate actually has had the emergency temporary ETS order actually lifted again, and it's been stayed by the Supreme Court. So that is no longer something that is pending as far as employers having to comply, and it is back down. It's been remanded to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals for final decision. So what that means is that the case is actually effectively dead because of the timeline here. They're going to have no time realistically to actually, require, because of the nature of the ETS, to shorten time period of 3 months. There's no way for this to actually come into effect. So in essence, the case is moot at this point for OSHA. But that's something that could come back into effect, like you mentioned. You were curious as to why it went through OSHA and not through the traditional process. We can talk about that a bit too. The court mentioned some things.
Right, and they seem to carve out, well, it depends on how you interpret it, I guess, but they carved out healthcare workers. But if you actually read the ruling, they carved out healthcare organizations that are directly federally funded.
Yes. So you're referring to basically a second case that was decided at the same time, which is the CMS case, and that has to do with organizations across the country, as you mentioned, that receive federal funds as a way of funding basically the Medicare and Medicaid programs that they run.
So does that?
And that case was decided differently.
Right. So we work in a private clinic. We take Medicare and Medicaid. So does that mean that we're federally funded?
Well, there are a bunch of exceptions to that. I'm not exactly sure if you're qualified under the CMS. That's not I would have to look into it and actually do a bit of research to see what qualifications you have there. You're asking me a very specific question that I just don't know the answer to. I'm sorry.
So it's not for our listeners who, that are not schooled in all this. It really isn't just simple black and white. If you take Medicare or Medicaid or employ that doesn't mean that you fall into that category. I mean, there's all those qualifiers as far as how you're.
Exactly. Yeah. The statute
category. Yeah.
In particular has all these things.
Right. Because we have a lot of physician listeners, and actually, which I think is a tremendous thing, there is a pretty significant growth in a couple areas in healthcare from the entrepreneurial side, which are private clinics that take insurance like ours. And then, of course, direct patient care, where you take subscriptions and you don't take any insurance at all. And so those people, of course, if you don't take any insurance at all, you're completely scot-free. You can kind of, as long as you obey the Medical Practice Act of your state, you're good to go. You're, out from under tons of regulation.
I'm thinking
but
even
again,
not in just in terms of physicians, but say, for instance, dentist offices. Those are like typical small businesses, usually employing half a dozen employees.
But this doesn't. This is OSHA specific, though,
right.
so it doesn't vaporize our local state mandates.
No, it doesn't. We're talking. So the California mandates in place right now relative to masks are still in place. We're doing all that we can to fight those out in California, but this was a very specific mandate for basically businesses with over 100 employees, with relative to OSHA having a vaccine or testing and masking requirement as an alternative. And that was struck down on constitutional grounds on what's called the major questions doctrine. But the other case was differentiated by the court, and that is the Medicare Medicaid funding case. And in that case, the way they basically distinguish the two issues is that historically, in the way that the legislation was drafted in this instance, they have taken steps to mitigate certain diseases relative to tying or making this funding contingent upon certain health requirements in the past, and therefore this particular mandate is something permissible as opposed to the OSHA mandate when they decided the constitutionality of that question. One of the things they did is they looked historically to the types of actions that OSHA as an agency has taken, and whether or not the court basically was considering whether or not this mandate, comparatively to what they've done in the past, was excessive, relatively speaking. Was it a gross, basically self-grant of authority by OSHA to have a heightened level of authority over the American people? And the answer here was yes from the court. And I can go into the details if you'd like to compare some of the issues they had done in the past.
So, yeah, I think it's important for our listeners to understand why the federal government used OSHA, because I think there is a tremendous number of essentially non-elected bureaucratic offices that act like the tentacles of the Hydra. and I remember when this was almost 9 years ago, we took our kids across the country and we went to DC, and here I am pounding into my teenage children. Okay, see that gigantic building? That is the national office of the Department of Education. I said, why does the federal government have anything to do with education? And then we go to another building and I'd say, okay, that's the the office of urban renewal or whatever. And I said, well, why does Washington DC have anything to do with what happens in specific cities? I said, this is, and then we'd stand on the platform and wait for the subway, and there'd be some 20 or 30 something with a really nice suit and carrying a briefcase. And I said, that guy there, they run the country. The staffers are the people that write the country. They look at the law, they write the regulations for whatever agency they work for, and they essentially are the ones that affect your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the broadest, most accurate picture that anyone could ever have here. You're talking about a corporation. The United States is acting as a corporation, and the difference between this corporation and an entity like Google is that this entity happens to have the power of the gun behind it. They have a monopoly on violence, and they are acting, like you say, through their administrative agencies, basically wielding their power over individuals' lives with these huge power grants they were granted by the legislature. And that's a full another story to talk about how we got to these administrative this state agency sort of situation. But yeah, if this had gone the other way, even the dissenting opinion here basically was saying, well, we have an emergency and the Constitution is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is that people's lives are being lost, and we need to give this state agency this huge grant of authority, irrespective of what the legislature actually gave them back in the 1970s. It's a dangerous argument to be made. It really does show that we are one vote away when it comes to the Supreme Court as to how this country is going to end up being run.
Yes. Yeah, it is sobering to say the least. Which I guess as a physician, what just blows my mind is it's painfully obvious now that the vaccines are non-sterilizing, so they can't stop spread. They've obviously not stopped spread. Ergo, all of the arguments of you get vaccinated to save your grandmother are completely out the window. You get the only thing that scientifically you can say is you get vaccinated to save yourself. At least for a period of time, there appears to be reasonably robust protection from advanced disease. Okay. Now that's probably all completely out the window with Omicron. So you have a vaccine that makes zero difference as far as the transmission of the illness, yet somehow you can mandate an experimental agent for people to take that doesn't stop the pandemic. It's impossible to stop the pandemic with a non-sterilizing vaccine. We've known this since, Jenner in the 1700s. So like, how does that, like, I just don't, it kind of, my head blows up.
Yeah. You're basically getting to the heart of the issue here, which is whether or not these administrative agencies have the constitutional authority to, make these types of broad, sweeping regulations that are antithetical to science. And you're pointing out the fact that the court seems to have just, looked the other way relative to what the evidence actually shows. And I mean, not only that, some of the things that were stated by some of the Supreme Court justices were just absolutely, that they were disinformation, they were false, and they were stating them on the record permanently, which they have yet to correct. None of these justices, to my knowledge, have said some of the most ridiculous things. I actually have a list here. Let me, if you don't mind, I'd like to point out some of the things that were stated during oral argument to show how far off that the justices are. And the first one here is COVID deaths are at an all-time high. That was Justice Sotomayor who stated that during oral argument. That's false. It was a lie. Whether it was intentional is not something that I want to speculate to, but she certainly has a duty to come out to the American people and apologize and correct that. She also stated that Omicron is deadlier than Delta. There are 100,000 children are hospitalized with COVID at the time of argument. That was in January. That was something like 8 times off the actual number. That was a fear-mongering statement, if there ever is one, and it's disgusting, and it should be corrected by Justice Sotomayor if she has any dignity or humanity and self-respect. She will go on the record and actually apologize. That's something that she should do. I think that the Justice Kagan stated specifically that vaccines actually stop transmission, as you've pointed out, especially with Omicron. This is no longer the case. That vaccine mandates would prevent 100% of cases. That was something that I believe Justice Breyer stated. That was at least the idea behind the OSHA mandate. Again, it doesn't make any sense because given the present circumstances, the evidence shows this is not something that actually is a rational policy. And the issue here, the reason that all of this is happening is what's called a legal doctrine called Chevron deference. So if you're not familiar, the idea essentially was, and this is what happened back in the 60s and 70s in the United States. It comes back to a bit of history here. We had a huge problem in the U.S. federal court system as far as backlog goes. There was a huge delay in the litigation time. Like, people would be waiting for months and even years sometimes to litigate a lot of these issues. Because, when these agencies would take actions, they would have immediate challenges. And so that the court system wanted to help declog the federal system. And so they came up with this concept during a case that had to do with Chevron, the oil company. Essentially what the court said is that when an executive agency makes a decision, we are going to give these agencies great deference in their own ability to basically decide the constitutional authority of their own actions. So when it comes to whether or not an agency action actually violates the Constitution or a person's civil rights, the agency actually is almost given a significant, almost complete degree of control over whether or not their actions are constitutional. And the standard here is whether or not the actions are what's called arbitrary and capricious. Those are the words the court uses. They will only overturn agency acts or mandates if they are, quote unquote, arbitrary and capricious, meaning they don't make any reasonable sense at all. Here, you seem to have that issue come into play because, obviously, the policy itself doesn't make any sense relative to the timing of the arguments being made in today's world, because they were trying to say that the policy is to stop the spread, right? But the court, giving deference to the agency, really wasn't questioning the particular, the facts being put into place by the agency. They basically got, because of the way the statute was written, OSHA actually got to basically write the record and limit the record to what the court was considering. And it's all of this has to do with just bad policy. That's where we're at today. It's giving too much power away by the courts.
So correct my small brain with legal stuff if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is in these situations, the court basically gives free sort of rein to these agencies to kind of make their own rules, so to speak, pushing the boundaries of the legal law to what these agencies think is the legal limit of the law. And then once the line gets crossed, it's up to, I don't know, people like yourself or the public to kind of cry out and then prove that they crossed the line.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of it?
Yeah, but the battle is uphill because the courts in analyzing these situations give significant deference to the agencies, like you say, their own claimed authority to act. The constitutional permissibility of their actions are something that they get to decide, which is just crazy. And that's just a result of bad precedent being set by the court. And, that was one of the issues here. It was whether basically this constituted under the major questions doctrine. There was a major question as to the constitutional permissibility of this executive agency's decision. So the court basically said, all right, if this is a gross expansion of the authority of the agency that the agency is basically bestowing upon themselves, then it violates the major questions doctrine. And what they look to, because this is a vaccine mandate in particular, this is the way the court reasoned. They said that a vast sweeping mandate of this magnitude is not something that the legislature in the 1970s would have even considered when passing the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And they hadn't even considered the types of danger even that the OSHA is claiming to have the authority to control. We're talking about occupational safety hazards like hard helmets. You're talking about instruments, things like punch presses. Regulation of the occupation is something that is not, actually being promulgated by this particular ETS, because this affects everyone. It's not something you can put down and walk away from when you leave work if you have to put a needle in your arm. That's something that goes home with you. These are all reasons the court pointed to, but just one more point here. They also looked at the history, as I mentioned earlier, and one of the things that they analyzed here was whether there were any similar actions that OSHA had taken relative to vaccines in the past. And they actually, one of the things the Sixth Circuit was really kind of making an argument for, which I thought was a bit ridiculous, is that they actually had acted in this way in the past. They have dealt with vaccines. They had done these things, and they pointed to the 1990s hepatitis B and HIV outbreaks through the U.S. And in that case, basically, Congress actually, comparatively here, they gave them express authority to adopt a law that would basically give these Hep B vaccines to employers where, and this was the limited scope of that ETS, it was provided specifically to employers who had a heightened risk for their employees of contracting these types of diseases. So we have a very narrowly tailored sort of statute in that instance. Well, here, it's a one-size-fits-all. There's no risk stratification. There's no, just for hospital employees. It's everyone. This is a general danger to the public, though. And that's why the court said OSHA didn't have the authority to act here.
Okay, that makes wonderful sense. Now,
I guess my question is how. So now that this has happened, now that they've said you can't do that, what is the ramifications, and how do you undo the damage to all the people that had to comply and are left with, I don't know, potential injury or oppose that? I mean, are we looking at litigation from that side of things? Or is it like, oops, you screwed up. It's just the way it is. What do you think?
Yeah, you were asking for me to speculate about the future in a world where everything is on fire, and we haven't seen any of these issues before. I'll do my best though. So really, what you have here is if you have an employer pointing to, for instance, the OSHA mandate as justification for why they actually, pass these vaccine mandates for their employees. Well, now that we know that the ETS actually was constitutionally invalid, it's not a constitutionally valid law. We'll just figure out at the end of the Sixth Circuit's reasoning, and hopefully that will be appealed, and there will be a final decision rendered from the Supreme Court on this issue, so we understand it eventually on the merits here. But for the time being, it's like we're in the Wild West, and there are going to be lawsuits filed left and right, basically claiming that employers engaged in illegal activity by requiring this, this illegitimate mandate and trying to preemptively have their employees comply. And in that case, you're not protected from your illegal actions as an employer. So let's say you had some employee who was injured, for example. Traditionally, that would fall into a workers' compensation claim. So workers' compensation, for people who don't understand, is it's an area of law that is state specifically governed, and it basically provides medical treatment and care to those people who are injured in work-related incidents. So here you have a work-related incident, the requirement of a vaccine as a contingent precedent to continued employment, right? That they were injured as a result of that. But what happens if it was illegal? Well, traditionally, if it was a legal action, that would be paid by the workers' compensation insurer, right? Well, now we have an illegal act. So theoretically, there's going to be a lot of like subrogation claims to recover money already provided to patients who have had treatment for these types of things by insurance companies. I actually see that happening pretty quickly, because if you have an illegal act, you're not protected from those legal actions. I don't have a duty any longer to pay for these insurance costs, and I actually have a right to go and be reimbursed from you, the person who was actually at fault here for this injury, because workers' compensation is not something that's covered by the intentional illegal acts of employers. If you cause an injury, you can still sue in regular court now. So we're talking about a whole mess of litigation that's going to be very complicated. It's going to have a lot of moving parts, and it's going to go on for a very long time.
It's interesting though, because I see something.
Just the beginning.
We talked to another
of
attorney a month or two ago.
Personal injury litigation era.
There's a couple things here that I see just from a physician side that are quite obvious to me. Number one, if you own a plumbing company and you have 200, you have a very successful plumbing company and you have 200 people working for you, and you say you have to get this medical treatment, which is, the vaccine or, the gene therapy, that is the mRNA, preventative for COVID, you're practicing medicine without a license. And I asked him that, and that's what comes to my mind.
It's a very good question. Yeah.
He said, because anything, if you look at the Medical Practice Act, there's like 50 of them, right? Every state has their own Medical Practice Act, and so, and he said, yeah, he thinks, he looked up the definition of what does it mean to practice medicine, and it's if you suggest or prescribe any treatment. Well, you are telling somebody who you have zero knowledge of their risk stratification score, because you are not a medical practitioner, you must get this treatment. That seems to me like practicing medicine. And I'm wondering if another legal angle for people is not to overwhelm their state medical boards with, companies that are practicing medicine without a license. I'm sure the medical boards would love that, because it's not like they're not dealing with enough, stuff. But that one just struck me immediately as kind of a different legal angle. The other one is
the entire public that's practicing medicine without a license.
Right.
You just go on social media chat and everybody's got their 2 cents.
But the other one that I find really interesting is how the state and the federal government has been incredibly crafty in kind of putting off what they've wanted onto private business. I don't see anyone suing a state and being successful. But I see lots of potential where companies have really taken this and pushed it to the nth degree. I think the low-hanging fruit from a litigation perspective is universities. Universities requiring now a third shot plus masks. To a cohort that's of unbelievably low risk for native COVID and still has reasonable risk from the vaccination. So, as I texted to you before, like I see this as, Penn State all over again, right? Like all you have to do is kill the right person, the homecoming queen or the captain of the football team for some, major university with a vaccination. And it's Penn State, Jerry Sandusky all over again. I mean, as soon as one of these cases breaks through and people hear the beeping sound of the Brinks truck backing up, like it's going to be like you talk about Wild West now, it'll be Wild West in an entirely different way.
Oh, you're 100% right. I mean, people freaked out the other day when Antonio Brown ran off the field, took his shirt off, like shoulder pads off, and ran off. That was a slight mental break that caught the attention of the entire nation. What's going to happen when then we can actually look at probability speaking, this is going to happen at some point. An NFL player or a college athlete in one of these high profile sports just falls over dead on the court, and at that time we're going to have the floodgates open. But universities are the lowest hanging fruit. Actually, that was my first the dream lawsuit that I have right now, and I'm hoping someone may be out there listening to this that might be able to help connect me with some of these people. The University of Virginia disenrolled 250 plus students a week before the semester started at the beginning of this year because they were unvaccinated. As you mentioned, even from the Alpha variant, they don't have a significant risk of personal consequences so long as they are part of the 60% of the population that is not obese, or having other underlying conditions. I don't know what the total percentage is there, but a huge number of these young, healthy adolescents in particular were discriminated against simply because they had a difference of opinion when it comes to a risk-benefit analysis to permanent changes for their bodies. And that was one of the things that I found most repugnant in this world, is the idea that you basically, as an employer, as an educator, as someone with a little bit of control over someone's life, think that it's okay basically to exercise plenary control in response to something that really doesn't endanger those people at all. And you're doing so in the name of the greater good. And it's quite objectionable.
Well, I think, it totally disgusts me because where's the line? I mean, it's like, well, then everybody here needs to get an STD test because we want to make sure that you don't have, herpes or chlamydia or like.
Well, but you look like a slutty whore.
So we need to test you.
Thanks. Seriously, where does it stop? I always jokingly say I'm more worried about like the communal cup going around in a Catholic ceremony where everybody might have a cold sore than what's going around with
Catholics
COVID.
Don't get herpes.
Yeah, exactly. So how a university could say, well, COVID is a concern, but where is this? It's a slippery slope. Like, where do they draw the line? Honestly,
let's rewind the retrospectoscope here. Okay, so if you want to talk about pandemics, epidemics, and an epidemic that Dr. Fauci was intimately involved in, which made his career, which was HIV, and he was very committed to randomized controlled trials in HIV. He didn't want to have any drugs that were, repurposed, like using Bactrim for pneumocystis carinii and all this stuff that went on, 40 years ago. But, I think rightly, we're very sensitive to how we communicated about HIV. Can you imagine if we would have come out with, this was concentrated in the male homosexual community. I mean, that's where it came. That's where the disease was concentrated. Can you imagine if we would have had some massive, you can't come to university if you're gay because you're going to transmit AIDS? Like, are you kidding? Like, even trying to say that is just like saying, the N-word or something. Like, it's so unbelievably repugnant to the ears of people nowadays. But it's no different. It's no different. Like, here was a group of people that had a significant risk of a disease that we didn't know much about. And then yet we know a fair bit now about COVID and its risks to young people. And we're mandating that young people get the vaccine, that you can't, and look, we were vaccinated, and I've told tons of people to get vaccinated, and it's based on a risk-benefit ratio. I mean, should children be vaccinated? Well, if I had a kid with cystic fibrosis, I'd have probably vaccinated him. A normal, like a kid with absolutely no medical conditions, of course I wouldn't, because that's the way medicine works. It's, and so, you kind of change the framework. You use the same principles, but change the framework, gay males, black people, whatever, subgroup. And you go, well, no, we would never do that. That's terrible. But you are doing it. The subgroup now is just the unvaccinated.
Mm-hmm. You really are. Yeah, I want to go back to the point that you raised earlier that I don't think I ever closed the knot on, because it relates to this and what is happening here when it comes to the OSHA being the body, through which this type of regulation was passed. And the Supreme Court actually, the per curiam decision, the majority opinion here, they pointed out the fact that the chief of staff for the Biden administration had actually tweeted, they cited the tweet, that they knew they could not do this through the traditional legislative process, which would be the proper avenue for this type of broad sweeping vaccine mandate. So instead, they went through OSHA. That was actually part of the record, and it just points out, just like the CDC's eviction moratorium, sometimes when you put the wrong people in power, they're going to do things to try and have temporary solutions to move people towards certain goals, irrespective of whether or not those goals are laudable, whether those goals make any sense. And I want to take one more step back, even because there's an analogy to be drawn for our current situation that I've mentioned a few times elsewhere, but I think that everyone should really consider, because it shows us, or I believe it will show us, how we can respond here and get out of this. And really what we're seeing today is no different than what was happening back in the early 2000s with Operation Iraqi Freedom. And I'm a huge fan of the military members who go out and risk their lives to save every single person that many times they don't even, will never meet, won't care about, whatever. But the idea of defending their country is so strong to them that they are willing to risk their lives. I find absolutely amazing. And what happened, though, in Operation Iraqi Freedom is you had General Colin Powell go before the world, the UN, along with a bunch of people who had R's behind their name. And those individuals, this is basically it's a movement. What we are witnessing is the movement between an industrial complex and a political party. Back then it was the R's, and it was the military industrial complex. And basically what happened is you had a bunch of people go out and lie about the reasons for invading another country, and hundreds of thousands of people died. And some people got very, very wealthy. People on Wall Street, people people at Halliburton, people at those types of Blackwater operations got very, very wealthy. The only difference is here you had people who had D's in front of their names go out and essentially propagate these lies. They continue to do so. And their friends, the people who put them in office, are getting very rich. But really the difference here is you have the hundreds of thousands of bodies piling up on our own shores. And it's a little bit closer to home, and people are starting to realize this. And so the way we move out of this, in my mind, is we look back at history and we say, all right, how did we respond as a society relative to Operation Iraqi Freedom and the revelations that we now know that this was all a farce? It was based on lies. Those people were not held accountable. Why? What can we do here to change that? And that's really my focus is I want to start asking that question and finding ways to, with the law, to be creative to start holding some of these bad actors accountable.
Well, I even just, and for me, a person that's always been sort of, like I said, fascinated with, history, especially looking back at, what happened in World War II and the experiments done on people in the name of science, as well as, we look at Tuskegee and we were talking about that, and, enrolling people in these studies and not disclosing information and not treating people when they knew there was treatments available. I'm like, how is this not history repeating itself? I mean, I see this as a giant, scary experiment worldwide, not just in the United States. And I'm like, people wake up. I mean, you're being experimented on. I mean, yes, there's a pandemic. Yes, obviously, it's like the name of, we want to prevent massive casualties and death. But when does it get to the point where it's like, now we're out of that area, but we just want to keep pushing the limits and seeing what happens and using this to continue the experiment and to turn it into a big social change, like a big world order social change. I mean, vaccine cards, to vaccine passports, to social credit system. I mean, it just seems to be like this slippery slope that you just slide right into. So while there's the cases and the litigation on that side, to me, it's like a massive moral issue with what we're doing medically, to what we're mandating, to people's health information not protected anymore, to like your physician and you don't get to decide what's right for you, to the government gets to decide the health of the people, and it just boggles my mind.
Yeah, well, it's so confusing. I mean, we keep going back to the nightmare scenario that we keep waking up in, but there's another historical example that you might find interesting here that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and that is the tobacco industry. And almost verbatim, the analogy exists. You had physicians at one point in time in the United States were actually telling people on the payrolls, again, of these organizations in some instances, of going out and saying, we believe that this product is actually good for you. It's something that you should use. You should smoke cigarettes. It actually has all of these benefits. Well, we, at some point as a nation, started to realize that after a certain amount of time, we were being lied to. And we responded accordingly, and there were a bunch of lawsuits filed against the organizations responsible. The difference is here is that you have liability bars in place for the organizations that were granted basically immunity from lawsuits, despite how bad their products might or may not be. It's frankly disgusting. And if you're going to mandate something for people's personal consumption, and you're going to have it be across, especially for children, it's like, if it's safe and effective, waive your liability. Go ahead. Like, we're happy to have kids. Like you said, there are certain children that should be taking these types of treatments, and in certain circumstances, all sorts of people. But for me, I'm 29 years old. I have lost something like 30 pounds in the last few months, working my butt off trying to get healthy. And I supplement my diet with vitamin D. I do all of these things. I've done more than anyone could ever ask me to do, as far as taking steps to protect others from me being sick and spreading this disease to others as well. It's like, why is it now that we have this one sort of square peg that we're trying to shove into a circular hole? And the answer is money. And it's very simple. It all comes back to the universities and the way that their financial structures are created. That's why there are 300 plus 300 medical institutions in the United States, academic medical institutions, and not a single one has a COVID-19 protocol. It has to do with the way that they're funded.
Yeah, it just, going down a rabbit hole. It's the whole thing of, we said, like, it's just the hypocrisy of, get your jab, and then Dunkin' Donuts is going to give you free donuts. I mean, look at our health of our nation just sucks. And has there been an outcry about people abusing their bodies, obesity, feasting on fast food, and ending up in hospital as a result of it, with like diabetes and heart disease and stroke, and being in the ICU because of that, and the public's paying for it? No. But anyway.
Well, right, because that feeds, that feeds the medical industrial complex.
Right.
I sat on the parent board of a multi-hospital organization, and this is like 10, 12 years ago. Every bypass you do drops several thousand, $10,000 plus to the bottom line of the hospital system. And that's not physician wages or anesthesia wages or anything. That's what the hospital makes, And so, and we were comparing, it was fascinating. We were comparing these, gyms to a bypass. And the reality is, you can open a gym, and you might, if you have a really good gym that's like really well run, and you have, several hundred members, you might be able to drop 10 grand a month to the bottom line of the gym. But all you got to do is one, major procedure, and you're doing that. So what are you motivated to do? I mean, when you're a hospital administrator, you're there to keep the place solvent. You're not there to be, Florence Nightingale, right? I mean, you're hired to keep the place running financially. And otherwise, why did they hire you, right? You just have doctors and nurses and no one else. And so you sit there and you go, wow, okay, I get it now. I mean, so as long as the hospitals aren't overwhelmed, and as long as people aren't quitting, who cares if people are fat? Who cares if people get cancer? Who cares if their joints explode? We have a really expensive way to deal with that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do. And it's something that's going to improve our lives, relatively speaking. So even if it does cost that person, their livelihood, their health, their well-being, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because we're making money and our interests are protected. And that's what corporations are, even nonprofit organizations. I think I actually was listening to one of the episodes that y'all had earlier. I was trying to familiarize myself with your show, and I listened to the year in review. And I'd love to come back on and actually talk about my struggle with opioids when I was a young man, and my recovery. And I've been clean from opioids for quite a long time. But that's a different conversation.
You're 29. You are a young man.
I feel old. My body's broken. It's
sorry. I just from my side of the ledger, it's like, yeah, you're still a young man.
All right. Well,
anyway, sorry to interrupt.
It's all of it is maddening, and I'm sorry, I did lose my track of thought there.
No, the opioids.
Yeah, well, it goes back to money. It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's a lot easier, I think you mentioned, to basically prescribe these drugs and kick it off to Purdue Pharma to have all of these huge profit margins for these people without actually solving the problems. And the way that even our academic institutions today, our medical institutions, are structured, it's like my one of my friends that's relatively close here is a physician, and he talks about his training. He's still in his residency, and it's like all he does for right now in this position is basically regurgitate pharmaceutical outcomes for specific problems being presented. It's like, okay, here's X, Y, and Z. Here are the symptoms. What's the problem? How do we address that problem with the pharmaceutical? It is basically the way that a lot of the medication, the medical field is being trained right now. That doesn't teach necessarily critical thinking skills. That doesn't challenge an individual to think outside of the box and go towards perhaps the environment itself and start asking, well, what is causing this problem, as opposed to just addressing it with a Band-Aid, going to the source and addressing those issues. And that's why, at least for a COVID policy, like you mentioned, it's a lot cheaper and more effective to start educating people on personal health, but it makes a lot more money for the hospitals to do the alternative. And so when you have powerful organizations controlling large vast of society, they can write the narrative in the book on how they want things to be done. It's rather unfortunate. And you had someone talk about unions on your show recently. I didn't get through the full episode, but there are solutions. One of them would be unionizing physicians. Another one, in my opinion, actually a better solution, is to start your own hospitals. I know it's extremely expensive. I understand that to get things going, but starting a 501c3 organization is not that complicated. You can do it with a good lawyer pretty simply. I actually have one that started my 501c3 organization that did a wonderful job. I'd be happy to recommend. But like really, I'm went on a podcast last night. I said the same thing. People need to start their own hospitals. They need to go out and start alternative locations to compete with these giant conglomerates, because at the end of the day, they only have the power they have because they are basically acting as a cartel. But if we start to compete with the cartel, we can really rewrite the narrative and change things in society. And I hope someone out there is perhaps inspired enough to contact me. If someone's interested in actually going through with this, I'd be happy to help. Go to my website, thegavelproject.com. You can actually email me as well, physicians@thegavelproject.com. I represent individuals who are also, by the way, if you're having your medical license threatened because you're speaking out, please contact me. I would love to sue medical boards who are trying to take away your livelihood for simply exercising your free speech rights. It's okay to have a different opinion. That's what the First Amendment says. And when you have state actors, as you mentioned, medical boards are created by state statutes. They're state specific. So when you have state actors sitting on these boards discriminating against you for your free speech rights, they're actually opening up themselves to personal liability, not just the medical board itself as an entity, but the physicians who are sitting on the medical boards. If they are trying to regulate your speech, they're violating code section. So it's Title 42, Section 1983, which is the Civil Rights Act. And if there are monetary damages in place, I know that Dr. Malone's physician up in Maine actually had her license suspended. She has a valid claim right now for monetary damages, and she can name under this code section every single one of the physicians on that board personally and sue them personally for their civil rights violations. So it's nice to have that cudgel there, and I'd be happy to help any physician out there that is having a similar issue. Please apply on my website.
My sense is that physicians are a very groupthink-oriented profession. You never want to be out of the mainstream, especially as a medical student, because then, it's quackery, it's this, it's that, it's all sorts of things.
It's not think outside the box. It's stay inside the box.
Yeah, no, it really is. Well, it's Chinese foot binding levels of stay inside the box. I mean, it really is amazing. The peer pressure in medicine is not necessarily overt, but the kind of hidden pressure to not be the outlier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's more peer pressure than, when you're 13 behind the school with a pack of smokes and someone's trying to get you to try one. Like it really is staggering. And so you get groupthink. I mean, the opioid crisis, we mentioned it before.
Mm-hmm.
The opioid crisis came from really super bad science, zero critical thinking, and massive physician groupthink. We started that as a profession. Purdue Pharma did not start it. They were opportunists, as every good business is. And then you got piling on from big pharma. You got piling on with more and more bad science at massive conferences and so forth. And then the regulators got involved and said pain is the fifth vital sign. Really? Like what is horniness the sixth vital sign? I mean, it's just completely irrational. These are totally subjective things, and somehow they're vital signs. I mean, I was screaming about this 15, 20 years ago. I'm like, this is just nuts. This isn't science. And then finally we came back around. And then, of course, it gets worse because then we cut everyone off that we were maintaining on opioids. And then you get, heroin, fentanyl, and, you're right back in hell.
It's quite the Plus, it's like you take, as you mentioned, you take it away. Where do you go? Dirty products, and products off the street are not safe. I have multiple friends going back that have had issues with overdosing on things like this. I've been in and out of treatment facilities myself for opioid issues as well, and for behavioral issues as part of that. But it's difficult to entirely pin it though on physicians, and I will certainly I applaud both of you for identifying that problem. But as you mentioned, we need to start holding the individuals accountable who are profiting off of the ideological. Really, we have an ideological subversion of our nation that is occurring, and that is the result of what is happening at higher education institutions relative to their monetary streams. And I keep teasing this issue. If you don't mind, I'd love to talk about university endowment funds, how universities are now tied in with Wall Street, almost entirely controlled. Their entire funding mechanisms are controlled by basically Wall Street and by Big Pharma as far as the biomedical research goes in the United States. It's all tied in and controlled very closely, and it's frankly disgusting.
Well, that totally makes sense. And I mean, I think a lot of people could see that because there's always grants coming in. And yeah, at multi-levels, you got to have, obviously, with the research in the medical, the scientific side of things, Big Pharma supplying that. I mean, they're, from what I know, which is very little about how research works, I mean, Big Pharma farms it out to smaller research groups, which are going to be at the university levels, right? That are going to then run these experiments. And then the university, is going to be the one sort of under the auspices of the Big Pharma. So they have an interest to follow what they want to do. If that makes sense.
That's relatively accurate. Yeah. So you have Big Pharma basically going around looking for, let's flash back to May 2008, or not 2020, excuse me. So May 2020, when COVID is getting off the ground and we're trying to figure out which of these vaccine manufacturers are going to be the ones moving forward, right? And so there was this mad rush going around trying to find the effective vaccines. And it appears as though, at that time, not only is there pumping and dumping happening with, like, let's say, BioNTech is, I believe, there was an issue with perhaps Morgan Stanley, if I recall correctly, basically having some pump and dump issues around those types of Moderna and Pfizer stocks around that time. But what's really interesting about the financial side of things is that I really want to focus in on the way that the universities are funded today. And you mentioned that you have all these sort of small entities going to these colleges and funding the biomedical research. It's actually about 60% of biomedical research in the United States is funded in this way. Basically, you have private entities going and having contracts with individual professors in place to fund their research. And what people don't understand is a lot of times these contracts have gag orders in them. They prevent you from publishing any information that the person funding doesn't seem to like. Okay, they can control not only the way in which these studies are done, but which studies come to light and which people get to get additional funding based on their compliance or non-compliance with the narrative, right? And so that's the first major issue. Basically, American institutions today are subsidizing R&D for biomedical research and development across the board at a rate of something like 60%, which is kind of crazy. But I think that really the COVID issue comes down to university endowment funds. So are either of you familiar with what an endowment fund is? Is that a term that you've heard before?
Well, they have so much money that it just sits in this endowment and pays them piles of interest. So obviously that money is invested in, who knows where.
Yeah. So really an endowment fund is a giant pile of money that is put together and invested by the university through, traditionally, they're following what's called the Yale model. This was created by Yale. They're the ones who spearheaded this. They basically, all the universities now have what are called investment management companies that are attached. They're nonprofit affiliates that are attached to state agencies that manage these endowment funds. So, for example, the University of Virginia has the University of Virginia Investment Management Company. Harvard has the Harvard Management Company, and MIT has like some similar thing. It's ubiquitous across the board here. Anyway, these organizations realize that if you built up enough money, billions and billions of dollars, you could actually operate largely off of the interests earned on the investment. So the return on investment, it's compounding interest. For those who don't understand compounding interest, it means that so long as you continuously invest, you basically get to grow your money forever. It's a very tricky scheme, but anyway, they have billions of dollars that they control that are now actually controlled by Wall Street bankers. These funds, the endowment funds, these nonprofit affiliates, have a bunch of individuals. Basically, for example, UVMCO has people from BlackRock, from Deutsche Bank, from Bain Capital. Some of the biggest names on Wall Street are actually sitting and controlling these billions and billions of taxpayer dollars and investing that money, presumably, because we don't know, the way they invest these funds is kept secret. It's not public information. You have to file FOIA requests to get to the principal, and a lot of times that's blocked by the schools. But they basically have the opportunity, given that they're controlling billions of state dollars and investing it secretly, to engage in what's called self-dealing. They can give themselves the contracts to manage this money, and it gives them, revenue streams personally. That's an issue. But what's really fascinating about the endowment funds and what's happening here with COVID is that I did some research and I accidentally came across all of this. And it appears as though the endowment management companies at almost all of America's institutions also have high-level administrators from the universities sitting on the boards as trustees. And that's interesting because as a trustee, you have what's called a fiduciary duty to the organization, meaning you basically have to grow. If you're sitting on an endowment fund, your job is to act in the best interests of the organization. And if the organization's goal is to grow this seed money as much as possible and make as much money for the university, that's what you're going to do. Well, that's an issue if you happen to also be employed as an individual who controls all of the nation's public health experts. Okay, so what happens if you basically are sitting over billions of dollars and you control all of the nation's public health experts? Well, you could theoretically, and this is what appears to have happened, if you look back at the record, this is an example, but this is actually an example that's consistent across nearly all of the medical schools in the country. University of Virginia had a 3.5% return on their endowment fund investment between the dates of June 2019 and June 2020. That's an average market return, 3.5% sort of for that time frame, because we had COVID. It was a huge interruption. There wasn't a large return. Well, the next year, something interesting happened. It turns out that nearly all of the nation's higher education institutions, particularly those with medical academic institutions attached to them, had multi-billion-dollar returns on their endowment funds. So between June 2020 and June 2021, UVMCO went from having $9.9 billion in their endowment fund to having $14.5 billion. That's nearly doubling their endowment fund. So what happened? Well, from what I was able to glean, it turns out that looking at the public disclosure, the reports, they actually appear to have made changes to the way their money was invested. They put a whole lot of money into research and development, into all sorts of different areas, into certain stocks and organizations. We still don't know where that money was invested. And at the same time, theoretically, if your job is to ensure the performance of that endowment, which it is, and you also control the nation's public health experts, the opportunity appears to be very ripe for you to basically go out and take active measures to control the narrative and make things worse so that your investments would pay off. And this is one of the things that I pointed out to Dr. McCullough and actually explained to him that what he was most fascinated about, because it does explain, why it is that we have this orthodoxy in place in the medical institutions. And the interesting thing is that the other percentage of money, like let's say the non 60% that's going to fund this biomedical research, the remainder comes from the FDA, the NIH, the CDC, and basically payments from these endowment funds that are specifically marked for specific projects like this, right? A lot of times if you make a gift to an endowment, let's say as an individual person, let's say you're an alumni of the University of Virginia, you become very wealthy, you pass away. Well, you actually can put strings on the endowments. You can say, well, I want this, $20 million that I'm donating to the school to be invested for the purpose of funding cancer research. So that's like a limited funding. But basically, all of the investments, all of the financial interests for higher education institutions in the United States appear to be in favor of the COVID regime.
The corruption never stops. Like, I just think, how can that not be such a blatant conflict of interest that, I don't get it.
Well, how do you not have published every single individual stock trade of every single person in government? I mean, that should be, type in Fauci's name, type in like anyone's name, Kamala Harris, whoever, people on the, all these different appropriations committees, and go, okay, what are they doing? Like, what are they investing in? Did they put puts in all these stocks because they knew they were going to blow up in 2 weeks because of something they voted on? I mean, like, that should be easy.
Yeah, I mean, insider trading really is legal for politicians in the United States right now. That is a fact. You can completely within your realm, within your authority as a legislature, even have your like, for example, Nancy Pelosi is prime suspect number one. She basically has been in Congress for something like 3 decades, and over that amount of time, and I'm not going to say definitively, I don't want to have any definitive accusations that are going to get me in trouble here, but she has, in fact, her husband has made a significant amount of money. Her last estimated net worth that I saw was something like $120 million. She's the daughter of a politician. She doesn't come from money. That money was amassed over her career for the most part. And no one seems to be asking questions as to whether that is something we should change. And I think that there are people out there doing it, but it's not loud enough. We all should be screaming that, public servants should not be allowed to have private investments while in office. That is not, doesn't make any sense. There's a reason they're paid a salary. It's like, live off the money that we pay you.
Maybe she owns a bunch of eyebrow salons. That's all I'm gonna say. Anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna swing it a little bit different direction, and it might be a real fast stop here. So we talked really in depth, which is awesome, about the OSHA side of things. What do you think the future is for the healthcare side, people that have been reimbursed by Medicare, Medicaid, the court overturned that. So people that have been employed by big health systems or and have been fired, laid off, put on permanent administrative leave because they did not want to get vaccinated, get the COVID vaccine. Does that look like it's going to ever change? I mean, what are you thinking? I mean, because I know that we have friends on the left, friends on the right, people that have gotten fired, made their organization fire them, or like without a job, left healthcare completely. They're like, what's going to happen? Is there going to be some court overturn? Are people going to stand up and sue them? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. That's actually a wonderful transition to what my organization does. So at the Gavel Project, we have three primary objectives, and those are to end all COVID-19 government mandates. That's through litigation. I have a full plan in place. I've been working with quite a few attorneys actually out in California to line up a very specific lawsuit, which is what we're doing now in the city of Irvine. We actually have standing to sue based on a free speech issue, which we believe will end all COVID-19 mandates across the country. That's our objective, and to have a wide, broad, sweeping constitutional precedent on this issue in particular would be great for the CMS workers as well. So the reason that I'm focusing on the children is that in this instance, basically, my argument is very simple, and I'm a creative person. I have ADD, so for all the physicians out there and the audience who understand what that means, it means that I think a little bit outside the box for most issues. And I came up with this argument back early on in the pandemic, and I sat on it for a while, but it's simple, and it's actually the one that I quit my job to make. It's you as an individual citizen have the absolute right to refuse to comply with COVID-19 mandates from the government because the action under our current circumstances is what's called expressive conduct. It's an act of free speech protected by the First Amendment. It's the same thing as burning an American flag in a park. It's because someone, basically the court says that any action, this is the Supreme Court's words, not mine. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it's really simple. Any action that a court looking at or any person looking at would understand to be communicative. Basically, if your actions speak as loud as your words, if not louder than your words, the action is actually what's called expressive conduct. And that's because if a reasonable person looking at the action would understand it as having its intended meaning by the person, engaging in the act, it's protected speech. So, for example, I mentioned burning an American flag is protected speech because it has connotations. People looking at the action are going to understand that it is a message of protest. It's intended to convey that meaning. The same thing can be said for refusing to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. It's why states and the federal government cannot mandate that you stand, because that would be compelled speech. You would be engaging in a ceremony whereby someone looking at the action, the participation, would understand you to basically being accepting the underlying ideals of the ceremony. The same thing can be said for a vaccination. If you refuse to comply with a vaccination requirement, that is a ceremony. It is something that is basically requiring you as a citizen to accept a number of things. It requires you to accept the political position of, it's basically compelling political orthodoxy. It says you have to accept our policy determination as to usefulness, efficacy, all of these certain things relative to vaccines, you now have to accept as an individual. That's actually compelled speech. It violates your First Amendment rights. Same thing with the masking. Taking it off really sends a clear message to people. It shows that I am not, a subject. I am a free person. I will not comply with unjustifiable, really mandates that don't have the evidence to back them. And the cool thing about this argument is it actually does a number of things procedurally that are super beneficial. And so, one, because it's a First Amendment argument, we're fighting for kids. A favorable precedent on this issue would set a national precedent. It would actually end all COVID-19 government mandates because it's a free speech, First Amendment, citizen-specific issue across the board. All right, and then also, just from a strategic perspective, this argument is very beneficial because it actually shifts the burden to the government for the first time to justify its own actions for the policies that it's putting in place. Up until this point, all of the arguments that have been presented, as far as I'm aware, have required the individual plaintiffs to say, hey, the government's action is unjustified and it's their burden to satisfy that standard. Well, here, because of the way that the court analyzes these issues, we have to go through what's called intermediate scrutiny analysis. Okay, so the court's going to look at the situation and they're going to ask a number of questions. The first one is they're going to ask the government to define the constitutional authority of its action. All right. That's why, in my opinion, personally, the OSHA mandate and even the CMS mandate are not permissible. And this argument that I don't know if this was made or not. I'd like to see it made. But because you have a federal actor here engaging in what's called police powers, they are trying to regulate the public health and safety. They are actually expressly violating the 10th Amendment, which reserves the police powers to the states. And so the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution is invalid for that reason for federal mandates. State mandates, because it is reserved for them, they actually do have the constitutional authority to act, so the burden would be satisfied in that prong of the analysis. But moving on to the second prong here, the government actually has to narrowly define the problem. They have to explain what the issue is and what the objectives are. If they don't explain what the objectives are, they don't clearly define, like, hey, it's not just we're trying to save even more lives, which is what the whitehouse.gov, I believe, still says as the reasoning for these types of policies, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's ambiguous. It doesn't mean anything. Those types of things have to be in place. You have to say, all right, this masking mandate for students is intended to reduce the spread of COVID. It is intended to have this impact, right? And so right now, a lot of these things are unconstitutional for that reason. So the third prong of the analysis, though, and this is where it starts to get interesting, is that basically now the court's going to look at the situation. They're going to ask the jury to say, look, jury, here, because we have an issue of constitutional question, we need to decide whether the mandate itself is sufficiently what's called narrowly tailored towards its objective, whether or not it's basically if it is any more burdensome on the individual citizen's right to engage in the action of free speech than what is essential to effectuate the government's objective, then it's actually unconstitutional. And so one of the things that the government would have to do is they would have to say that this vaccine mandate, this mask mandate, is actually the most narrowly tailored policy towards effectuating our goals, which here again, saving lives, reducing hospitalizations would be legitimate, but ambiguous goals aren't. So the fact that, I just really quick point here to finish, the very fact that such treatments as monoclonal antibodies exist, the very fact that we have vitamin D and we have all of these studies demonstrating the alternative treatments for COVID-19 means that the government cannot succeed on that prong. Basically, they're fighting an uphill battle the entire time. And this argument in particular, if it's successful, and I'm very hopeful that it will be, is, in my opinion, what could end the COVID-19 pandemic across the board.
Wow. Okay. So you answered, I think, my question because, I don't understand law at all other than follow the law or else you go to jail with handcuffs on. Who wants to do that? I was, as you were explaining the in to this, which is the expression of free speech by, removing the mask or not taking the vaccine. And because I'm thinking, okay, devil's advocate brain here. What would stop me from saying, well, I believe that I can drive whatever speed I want to in my car, and my expression of that free speech would then be to speed and drive 100 miles an hour. And then, so what would be the difference from anybody applying that to any other aspect of laws and saying, well, this is my belief, and then the way I, express that free speech is to act on it, and that manner would be to then speed at 100 miles an hour. But the burden then, the next step is then the burden is then on the court to prove that those laws in place are there and are effectively doing what they say and protecting. Is that correct? So it'd be like, well, obviously you don't like this, you don't like the speed limit, May, and so you decide to express that by going 100 miles an hour like it's an Autobahn. But when push comes to shove, now the court is going to say, well, obviously speeding kills, it protects the lives, it protects those around you, so yes, you're at fault. So you're right. That's a very
You're astute. My constitutional professor, one of them actually pointed this analogy out to me, and I actually believe that a very easy analogy is that a seatbelt law. And in a similar way, this was my response to him. So just like speeding, and just like refusing to wear a seatbelt, refusing to comply with the speed limit, although perhaps intended to convey meaning by an individual engaged in that action, would not be considered expressive conduct, because the question really focuses on whether an average observer of the conduct would understand it to convey intended meaning. And here, basically, if someone's speeding, the average observer looking at someone who's breaking the speed limit isn't going to assume that the person is doing so because they intend to convey a message of protest. It's the same thing for seatbelt. Like, if you see someone not wearing their seatbelt in their car, they get a ticket. They're not going to be able to go to court later and say, well, Your Honor, I was just practicing my free speech rights by not wearing the seatbelt.
Exactly.
Therefore,
Right.
this law is unconstitutional, and money damages. All these issues that are in place here are just not at play, because someone looking at the action just wouldn't understand it as having any inherent meaning.
Well, what if I was going 100 miles an hour in a pickup with a bunch of Gadsden flags flying in the back? Wouldn't that be obviously a protest at that point?
So you're getting closer. No, that's actually a good point, because it's a contextual question.
Okay.
It looks at the circumstances. And that's why, in our present time today, this argument is so apt, because anyone looking at the action of refusal under what we know today to be true as far as the actual evidence goes, is going to understand it as sending a very clear message. And the message is, let's go, Brandon. It's like, don't step on me. I have the right to be a free citizen, and the government doesn't get to control my life.
Well, that's what we want, right? But I'm very afraid
Right.
for what's
No,
happening
it's
to
good.
our kids, who are your decade of generation, are going to be facing. And so, yes, let's stand up for protecting
Well,
us.
and it's interesting because I read a really good Substack from the Angry Cat, but he says it in Spanish and I can never remember. El Gato Malo. And he basically said, the mandators have the regulators have overstepped their boundaries so much that he thinks that ultimately this just blows up in their face, because it's so obviously egregious. It's one thing, and that's the thing, right? And maybe we can kind of button this up with this. You wouldn't have needed mandates if this was the smallpox vaccine. If everyone's getting smallpox and their face blows up in these massive sores, and then your kid dies, and you have a sterilizing vaccine that's super effective, that has hardly any side effects, and utterly stops the spread of smallpox. If you don't want to, then we'd be saying, look, if you don't want to take it, you're an idiot. And if you want to have a pockmarked face and potentially die, that one's on you, right? So the fact that you have to mandate it itself tells you that they don't have an argument, because there wouldn't be mandates for the smallpox vaccine. It would be obvious you would do it. There wouldn't be mandates even though it took 5 years to get the polio vaccine, because the initial polio vaccine, the doses weren't right, and it was actually infecting people with polio, and they had to kind of mess with it before it was ready for public consumption. People forget that. So in cases like that, as soon as it's mandates, it's like the ad hominem attacks. When you argue with somebody, that's the use of somebody that has no argument. It's like, okay, well, and so for me, it just seems pretty, yeah.
Because I say so, right? That's the standard here.
No, I mean, but that's exactly what it ends up coming down to. It just comes down to because I say so.
Yeah.
I mean, the goalposts have moved. It was to stop spread. It was to stop COVID. It was for herd immunity. That all went away. Okay, then it's for severe illness. Well, what if the severe illness case goes away? Then what is it? Then it's just, there's no randomized controlled studies for the boosters yet. Israel's on their 4th shot, and it still doesn't do jack for Omicron. So it's like we're done as far as I'm concerned.
I'm there with you. And you know what? It's a sad day. And I want to get back to plugging away for my organization, if you don't mind, because it's so important that what we're doing. I actually have children in California. This is what it's come down to. And this is the disgusting state of our nation. I have kids literally facing arrest threats from the school board for exercising their free speech rights. These are children. These are less than 10-year-old children, and their parents of these kids, my clients, the parents, the kids themselves, are incredibly brave for being willing to exercise their free speech rights. And you know, in the face of these types of threats. I mean, literally an email going out to one of my clients just a few days before she had her daughter actually last week engage in an act of peaceful civil disobedience in order to get standing to file this lawsuit. You know, it's a sad day, and so we need as much support as we can get. I am, like I mentioned, I'm 29. I didn't mention this, but I have a family. I'm a father. I have a 3-year-old daughter and another girl that's just even a few weeks old. She's 5 weeks old now, and you know, for me, it was a no-brainer because I saw my children's futures washing away. But what's really interesting about this argument that I'm bringing, I want to close on this if y'all don't mind, is that it actually asks the American people for the first time to decide the constitutional permissibility of the government's actions. So under Title 42, Section 1983, so long as there are monetary damages involved in one of these lawsuits, you actually get to have a jury trial on the constitutional permissibility of the government's actions. So all of the questions that I was asking you about the prongs of analysis, whether or not, you know, basically this is the most narrowly tailored policy to accomplish the government's goals, and whether there are any other treatment mechanisms or perhaps policies out there is a question for the American people to decide. And that's why this argument and this all of this is so important, because the Constitution is a weapon. You know, I actually have somewhere around here, it's not this one, I have a bunch of pocket constitutions. Oh, here it is. This was actually given to me by Justice Alito of the United States Supreme Court. He actually taught me constitutional interpretation. He was my professor for that. And people don't seem to realize the Constitution is a weapon. You just don't know how to use it yet. And really my objective is to demonstrate to the world how you as an individual citizen can wield this against the state to defend not only your civil liberties, but those of other people and your children in particular, which is the most important thing here. If we give up on our kids.
I get teared up because, like I said, our kids are just in their early 20s, mid 20s, and I'm just thinking of, you know, what they got to face if this all blows up and doesn't go the
well. Welcome to Australia. Like, what the hell happened there? I mean, we were born in Canada. We were educated there. We moved here 30 years ago, and I mean, like, what an absolute disaster.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
not just and, you know, even
and
Europe. Like, look what I mean. I don't know that people are paying attention to what's happening in Europe, but it's unvaccinated people are literally being treated like the Jews.
It's happening in America. I know kids in California that are literally being there was a school up in Northern California that had kids wear gold stars. The unvaccinated kids. I have parents calling me constantly, you know, wondering why it is that their kids are being put outside in 40-degree weather every day for refusing to wear a mask, for simply exercising their free speech rights. And it's frankly, this is in America, and it needs to stop now. And that's why it's so critical to fund organizations like mine. If you're out there and you're listening and you have the resources, please consider giving. You know, I've spent tens of thousands of dollars personally, my wife and I, to get this organization off the ground. Just to, I mean, I had liquidated a vehicle even back in August. We sold my vehicle and we were unable to purchase another one because starting these types of organizations is expensive and it's worth, but it's worth it. It's worth the risk for our kids, because if I didn't spend that money there on this issue, it's like, what's the point of saving for a future if your kids can't be free to enjoy their personal liberties and their rights? So I decided to take a risk with my wife, and she's a saint for sticking with me. So we're very grateful. I just do want to say really quickly, This is a nonprofit organization. We do not yet have tax-exempt status. We are hoping to solve that issue very soon. If you're interested in making a larger donation, please contact me. You can actually reach out to inquiries@thegavelproject.com. We welcome funding. We're looking for anything we can do to help these kids out in California, and litigation costs quite a bunch of money. So please consider going to my website, thegavelproject.com. You can donate there. Or if you prefer and you are interested in some of the things that I'm saying today, I actually started a Substack, and it's thegavelproject.substack.com. You can see I actually wrote an article there called Universities in the COVID-19 Money Trail. It explains very in depth everything that we discussed earlier as far as the financial situation goes of America's higher education institutions. And I'd appreciate any support I can get there as well. So if y'all want to be subscribing members, that would be wonderful. So please spread the word and let people know what we're doing. It would be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Outstanding. We will do that. We will link all that in our show notes as well. This has been...
Yeah, I'll push that all on my social media posts too.
This has been really great. I mean, it's fascinating because...
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah. Joe Rogan and lawyers are going to save the country.
Thank you. I feel blessed to be here. This is awesome.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. Wow. It never ceases to blow my mind the people that we've met in the last year.
I know, this is actually just knock your socks off, like amazing. I'm really excited to see what happens and where this goes. I mean, it's kind of, tragic that it's come to this, but wow, what a person. I mean, he's just like empowered and on fire to do this, and there's hope for people, which is really the great part of this.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how this ends, but when you look at Nuremberg Code, the fact that Pfizer doesn't want to release any of its information for like at least in totality for 70 years or whatever it was, 500 pages a month for or 5,000 pages a month for like a gazillion years, and how that stuff's already getting overturned. Brand new in this week, the British Medical Journal asked for all trial data for the vaccines and any of the EUA therapeutics, including monoclonal antibodies, to be released so it could be actually
good, because it sounded like those UFO files.
Yeah, assessed by other professionals. So pop the corn, kids, because the next few years is going to be a litigation festival.
I love it. So before we go, don't forget to reach out to Michael Relvis at MR Insurance, where their goal is to assist physicians in obtaining the most comprehensive coverage available to fit their unique situation. Reach out for both excellent and quality service at bsfreemd.com/MR Insurance.
Absolutely. Just a little shout out to the financial planning sort of pillars and how important, especially as a physician, when you've put in so much time and potentially have so much debt, early in your career, to not be covered with appropriate amounts of life and disability insurance, sets you up for potential failure.
Yeah, and you want to do it at the right time, not too soon, obviously not too late. So get some advice.
And your goal is to accrue enough wealth by the time, you're in your middle age years and want to slow down. You don't need any. But, boy, oh boy, for the vast majority of your career, you want to make sure you have appropriate disability insurance. No question.
Exactly. So check out his website. It's got all kinds of products on there. It's really good. See you next time.
The statements, interactions, and opinions expressed by Ryan Heath on behalf of the Gavel Project related to legal concepts, events providing context for discussing legal principles, legislation, and administrative and judicial rulings are intended for information and education purposes only. The statements, interactions, and opinions of Ryan Heath should not be relied upon for legal advice, nor are they designed to create a lawyer-client relationship. Ryan Heath and the Gavel Project accept no responsibility for any loss or damage that may occur based on reliance on the statements, interactions, and opinions expressed to the fullest extent permitted by the applicable law. Anyone seeking legal advice is encouraged to personally consult with a licensed attorney as soon as possible to prevent a loss of legal rights or legal recourse due to the passage of time. If you would like a consultation with the Gavel Project, please visit thegavelproject.com/contact to view your options.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit, uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more, and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
Well, we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.